The opinions expressed on the following sponsored program are strictly those of the host, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of this station, its staff, management, or sponsors. It's Down to Business with Jack Miller. Forget what they teach you in school. This is real life. Not Wall Street, but Main Street. He and his guests will answer your questions and provide you with valuable information. Stay tuned and join in the conversation. Follow them on Facebook at Jack Miller Down to Business or on Twitter at HJackMiller1.
When the earth was created.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to our show. So excited to be with you. Hopefully, we'll put on another good show. Todd, last couple of weeks, fantastic shows. Great feedback from our guests and the listeners. How you doing, Todd? Good?
I'm doing great. Great to be here, Jack.
Todd, I'm excited about the show. I think we have on the phone Dr. Philip Travis.
Dr. Phil.
Dr. Phil. I think the different one. I'm such a yodel, I didn't even pick that up, but whatever. He wrote a book called Reagan's War on Terrorism in Nicaragua. And this guy is an expert on U.S. international Cold War relations, especially in Latin America. And as you talk to him and read the book, what's fascinating is how he brings a lot of this stuff out to modern terrorism and the conflicts we have today. So I'm excited. Let's see if we can bring him online. Dr. Travis, are you with us?
Yeah, I'm with you. Thanks for having me on the show.
Thank you. I'm very excited to be with you. Again, everyone else, it's called Reagan's War on Terrorism in Nicaragua by Dr. Philip Travis. So, Dr. Travis, why don't you give us maybe some of the background or your background, or how did you get involved with this? Just like as a setup for the audience, then we just have like tons of questions for you.
Sure, yeah. Well, I grew up as kind of a service brat who moved around the country. I spent a lot of time on military bases, and this developed a kind of a fascination with international relations, and particularly growing up in the late Cold War. I was always interested in the Vietnam War, but when I got to graduate school and started working on graduate work, I realized that pretty much everything had been said about Vietnam, or at least it seemed. And the Central American conflicts I found very fascinating because there weren't a lot of new things that had been written about it, and there was so much that seemed unknown about it. All we had really were some of these older interpretations that were written by individuals during the actual time of the events with the Contra affair and so forth. And so it just sparked my interest, kind of a natural interest in international relations and military affairs and these types of things.
Got it. And where did you study this? Was this college and grad school, and where did you go?
Yeah, so the book, was developed as part of my PhD. The book is also, by the way, coming out in paperback this August. So it's been out in hardcover for about a year, and so the cheaper version comes out, which is a good thing. But I studied at Washington State University, and I'm an associate professor right now at the State College of Florida in the greater Bradenton-Sarasota area.
Pretty interesting. So maybe you can start off by, I'm just going to pepper you with questions if all right. How does terrorism look like in the 1970s? Like I'm going to trace it back to when I was young till now. What's changed, and how has the U.S. intervention in foreign countries and political affairs changed?
Yeah, in the 1970s, which it's really in the 1970s where we really see the modern sort of problem of international terrorism emerge, and it was particularly associated with the Israel-Palestine conflict. The interesting thing is in the 1970s, and a lot of folks might be surprised to hear this, but in the 1970s, terrorism when compared to today, by and large, and I say by and large because you would immediately think about the Troubles in Ireland, which is a devastating, maybe one of the worst terrorist conflicts of all time. But by and large, international terrorism in the 1970s was less violent than it is today. Today, we think about terrorism, we think about the most horrifying shock, destruction that you really can imagine. In the 1970s, terrorists used terrorism largely as negotiating chips. There would be hijackings, or there would be a raid. Like, for example, in the mid-1970s, there was a raid on on a dinner in Managua, Nicaragua, and they took hostages, and they used the hostages for exchanges. And there were many skyjackings or hijackings in the 1970s. And these were almost always used as bartering chips to get people released from, a prison in Israel, or to get somebody released from a prison in Nicaragua. They were very rarely associated with the mass suicide bombings that we think about today, with the big exception being, of course, the issue in Northern Ireland. Today, of course, we've seen terrorism become really much more violent, and in the 21st century, events of violent international terrorism have gone up quite significantly by comparison. In the 1980s, they went up a lot for the United States, and typically the escalation when it comes to the United States being targeted by international terrorists had to do with the United States' sort of close association with a number of, revolutionary events. The Iran Revolution, which leads to the hostage crisis, its involvement in the Lebanese Civil War, and of course, in Central America, its involvement in the El Salvadoran Civil War, and then likewise, by association, its involvement with Nicaragua through the Nicaraguan Contras.
So since the book was on, it's Reagan War on Terrorism in Nicaragua, why don't you tell us what happened from the U.S. perspective, from the Nicaraguan perspective, because I suspect a lot of our audience don't remember the Iran-Contra affair, or it's sort of a distant memory.
Yeah. I just as a brief note, it's like another reason for this project is to kind of dispel the myth that we seem to assume today that terrorism is always about the Middle East and the Islamic Jihad, but in fact the roots of terrorism are quite broad and not really honed into a particular stereotype, shall we say. But in the 1970s, Nicaragua experienced a revolution. Nicaragua was ruled by a dictatorship. It was a historically American-friendly dictatorship. And the United States ultimately witnessed, during the Carter administration, a revolution, really a popular uprising against that dictatorship. And the Carter administration, this was, of course, the revolution was led by the group known as the Sandinistas. And their primary leader was Daniel Ortega, who, of course, today, as we speak, is facing a pretty widespread uprising in his country today, because Daniel Ortega is the leader of Nicaragua today. The Sandinistas were a left-leaning country that overthrew the government of Nicaragua and tried to kind of install a kind of like Cuban, Soviet left-leaning country in Nicaragua. This was not something that pleased the United States, and it didn't please the United States under the Carter administration or the Reagan administration. The big difference between the two was that the Carter administration really sought to use diplomacy with Nicaragua. The Carter administration did not want to begin making war on Nicaragua to prevent the consolidation of that government. The Reagan administration, on the other hand, did, and a major justification for that was that simultaneously, or almost simultaneously, a civil war had broken out in El Salvador. And El Salvador was a brutal civil war, and the revolutionaries fighting the government were leftists. And anyway, to make a long story short, during the 1980s, the Reagan administration supplied a group of proxies, loosely known as the Contras. And they used these militants from bases in Costa Rica and particularly Honduras to attack the government of Nicaragua, and eventually hoping to achieve the regime change of the Nicaraguan government, which was, of course, a sovereign international power. The action began as a covert action, but it was really an overt action ultimately, and one that really flew against many of the traditions of international law.
So the U.S. tried to overthrow a government. Hasn't the U.S. been trying to do that for years, overtly or covertly?
So I think, yes. I think one of the big differences between the types of preemptive regime change actions that we associate with the war on terrorism, and I'm using the war on terrorism broadly to include this episode in the late Cold War. a difference between the sort of preemptive regime change of the war on terrorism and that of your examples from the earlier Cold War, like the overthrow of the Arbenz government in Guatemala in 1954, or the overthrow of the Iranian government in 1953, or, of course, its involvement in the attempt to overthrow Castro. I think one of the big differences is the overt nature of it. During the Cold War, the United States did meddle in a lot of affairs of other governments, but it very much tried to avoid any overt attempt to oust a foreign government. With the war on terrorism, and we see this precedent in the 1980s, the United States adopts a different legal line, basically saying that if a country is alleged by the United States to be a state sponsor of terrorism, that the United States reserves the right to use overt, aggressive military measures to overthrow that regime to prevent a future threat. And that's a big difference, the idea of doing it overtly. And the international community sits on the sidelines. It often disagrees. The United States just kind of, thumbs its nose to that.
Right, but recently in the United States, we've had this whole outcry of how the Russians meddled in our most recent election, which it's been proven to be fact. And I guess what Jack was getting at, and we all know it's true, is through our history, I guess, since we became sort of the world superpower after World War II, we have meddled in many other countries, not just their elections, but we've meddled in all of their politics, whether it was overt, whether it was through war, whether it was through funding an adversary. I mean, isn't that sort of the way that we've operated to instill democracy and peace throughout the world?
I think in the 20th century and in the 21st century, yeah, you do find that. You do find that a lot, yes. The United States has, particularly in Latin America and in the Caribbean, of course, the United States has used its influence in a number of different ways for a long period of time. And the book is really examining how the late Cold War, how the emergent issue of terrorism is sort of setting the stage for, if you will, the next phase of that, which we are in right now.
So looking back in history, 20, 30 years later, what mistakes, or do you think the U.S. made mistakes in its war on terrorism or its war in foreign country intervention?
Yeah, I think that the lessons to really be learned when we look at these types of interventions is really the shortcomings of using, military force or, putting hardline measures first instead of putting diplomacy first. In the situations like when we take Nicaragua, here's an example of a case where the United States basically, put a military, under the Reagan administration, put a military solution at the forefront. And there were individuals in the Reagan administration, like the leadership in the Office of Counterterrorism at the time, Robert Oakley, Parker Borg, who vehemently opposed the idea of putting military force at the forefront. And I think when we look at Nicaragua, and I think when you look at the 21st century, the use of military solutions when it's not a last resort. It was President Eisenhower who, of course, is famous for being, referenced as, among many, that war should be a last resort. And in this case, it wasn't, and it really created problems down the line for U.S. relations in the places where it intervenes like this. In the case of Nicaragua, the United States has really not had a positive, normal relationship with Nicaragua since. In the case of countries in the Middle East that the United States invaded, like Iraq, of course, following the September 11th attack, the results of that have been really a failure, maybe an initial success in terms of conventional military operations, but ultimately a failure in an effort at counterinsurgency that has created a lot of problems in the region and certainly doesn't appear to have created the stability that I think we assume the United States sought out of that. El Salvador is another good example because we were intervening in El Salvador alongside Nicaragua in the 1980s. And El Salvador, was in a civil war, and we supported the leadership, the government there. And in so doing, the United States created a counterinsurgency strategy there, used the Nicaraguan support for insurgents there as justification for its activities with Nicaragua. But the process ultimately created a tremendous amount of damage in El Salvador, but really was unable to obtain the kind of objectives that the United States wanted. At the end of the conflict in Nicaragua, the United States did not control the end game. Central Americans controlled the end game. And so I think it's really a lesson about the danger of putting military force, as the first, sort of measure in foreign policy, rather than a well-thought-out diplomacy.
Right.
So, do you think they haven't resulted in or they haven't had a positive result because we went in with force, or because we pulled out too soon and we didn't see it through to the end?
Yeah, this is one of the, obviously you're referring to Iraq. This is one of the big questions that people debate, and I can't say for certain. It's my feeling that given the fact, if we take Iraq, given the fact that the Iraqi regime had nothing to do with 9/11, we know that. Given the fact that Saddam Hussein was hardly cozied up to, international terrorists, I think that ultimately is an indictment of the military strategy there. I think we were successful ultimately. Now, whether or not staying longer and keeping more troops there results in some kind of eventual success is something that that can be debated. But I don't think the original use of military force in Iraq was justified. Whether or not troops were pulled out too soon and whether or not that would have fundamentally altered how things occurred is not something that can easily be known at this time.
So what do you think, extrapolating from your book and your experience in Latin America, how should the U.S. deal with terrorist countries or terrorist groups? Because it's great to say talk to them, but these guys are going out there and chopping people's heads off and doing all kinds of burning people alive, horrific things.
Right, yeah. So, you have to look at each situation for what it is. And, of course, my specialty is not with ISIS. But I do think that we need a more nuanced strategy when it comes to dealing with terrorism than what I think we've seen in cases in the past. I think that some of the issues, arise from the fact that our international system doesn't do a very good job of working together when there are legitimate terrorist threats. And so one of the problems there is you could have a case, take Iraq, for example, or take Nicaragua as the topic of the book. You can have a case where a country that is really not an international sponsor of terrorism is labeled such by one nation and then targeted with military force. And that in itself is problematic. And so I think that if we could come up with a way to have more consensus in the international community on these matters, it would help a lot. Because obviously, there's a lot of really, really terrible, terrorist organizations out there. And by no means am I saying that we should take that lightly. Only that in some cases in the past, we have seen terrorism used as a justification for an expanded usage of military force that I believe are for purposes that go beyond just the purpose of fighting that particular terrorist threat. And we want to, I think, avoid sort of hyper-interventionist policies, but rather get at the real root issue of the problem. And so I think that it needs to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis and needs to be done with greater international consensus.
Right.
Very hard to get international consensus when everyone has sort of their they're pulling in their own direction for their self-interest. And what you said reminded me of, I think it was Eisenhower who said one of the greatest threats is, I think, the industrial military complex, or some words like that.
Well, I mean, what do you say about the fact that a lot of these situations, that we have with terrorist organizations today are sort of direct offshoots from the meddling that our government did in the past, where they sort of had two horrible people and they chose one who was more allied with the United States, armed them, trained their forces, gave weapons to them, had them sort of do the dirty work of fighting what we perceive to be the bigger threat. And then after they prevailed, they became a chief enemy of the United States. I mean, you see this with Afghanistan, you see this with Saddam's Iraq, you see this with all sorts of countries, and even Iran, during this whole Contra affair. So what do you say about that, and how is that going to influence decisions made going forward, given the fact that it seems that we may have caused some of these terrorist organizations?
Yeah, I think that, when we look at the history, what we should be thinking about in the history is how our past policies have contributed to some of the issues today. And I think if we consider those lessons, then going forward in our policy, hopefully we can try to avoid some of those mistakes, because I think you're exactly right. So if you take, and of course I'm not a specialist on Iraq and ISIS, but if you take that as an example, here's a case where we have a situation today that is directly connected to U.S. policy in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. In that respect, it seems the United States has some responsibility to find a solution to what's going on there. But I do think when we look at the history of the Cold War, when you go back before World War II in Latin America, the numerous interventions, Nicaragua, Dominican Republic, Cuba, I think we see, a course of intervention here in which the United States has intervened, and oftentimes the United States has inserted a government that is no better to the human rights of the people there than what was in place before, and this then sows the seeds of potential conflict and revolution in the future. So I think you probably could argue that the 20th century, when it comes to U.S. interventions, is often a testament to the failure of the United States' efforts at, if you will, nation building.
Right. And a lot of that stems from, the United States following World War II and then World War I, we didn't want to get in more conflict. So we had other people fight the battles for us as proxies.
And this, of course, when we look at Nicaragua, of course, Nicaragua is a perfect example of a proxy war. And it was really a reaction to, for many in the policy establishment, this was really a reaction to Vietnam. Vietnam was really a wake-up call for a lot of folks, because you wound up with 500,000 soldiers in Vietnam. Ultimately, 60,000 Americans or so are killed there. And it became an incredibly divisive conflict in the American public. Nicaragua was, if you will, a first test case for the usage of, in the post-Vietnam War period, the usage of proxies and lower intensity counterinsurgency in El Salvador, and the usage of proxies against Nicaragua. And what happens with that, of course, is the United States can wage a policy that seeks similar aims. It can wage a very aggressive interventionist policy, and it can do it without undermining, the sentiments of the public as much, if you will.
Right.
There were protests to the Contra operations in Nicaragua during the 1980s, but they were nothing like what was going on during the Vietnam era. And so, when we think about the 21st century war on terrorism, the authorization for the use of military force after 9/11, that authorization, which is a loose authorization for the use of force in combating terrorism, is still in place today. And I think when we look at that, there's an example of numerous different types of low-intensity, irregular sort of proxy conflicts going on. And like the Nicaragua situation, like the counterinsurgency situation in El Salvador, these involve so few, direct headlines, if you will, for Americans that they tend to be more palatable in the American political world. They tend to be less controversial.
Right.
And it's a way that the Reagan administration, and I think still today, it's a way they wanted to overcome what was called the Vietnam syndrome, which was the idea that the United States had lost its ability to use its power to sort of shape the problematic areas of the world.
Dr. Travis, I hate to cut you off, but we have to go. Fascinating topic. Everyone, if you want, Dr. Travis, what's your social media contact information so people can look you up?
So I'm on Twitter, Philip W. Travis 1 on Twitter. I have my own website, philiptravis.com, and that's Philip Travis with one L. But if you go to www.philiptravis.com, I have a lot of information on there. I have an article I recently have written up there for you to view. There's information about the book. You can see my picture up there, these types of things.
Everyone check it out.
Yeah.
Dr. Travis, thank you. Reagan's War on Terrorism in Nicaragua. And I'll leave you with this, Dr. Travis and Todd and our listenership. You could say the U.S. made a lot of mistakes, and we did. But you know what? Looking back, I think we're one of the safest countries in the world. We're the most prosperous. We're by all means very successful. We've clearly made mistakes, but sometimes you got to scramble some eggs, break some eggs to survive, and I think that's what happened. But up for debate, and Dr. Travis, love to have you back again. Everyone else, thank you very much, and we'll be back soon.
Thank you.
Dr. Travis,
Thank you so
thank
much.
you again.